Hello, everyone. 5 people here, 2 likes. And David 2010 says, hello I'm from Wollongong, Australia. Hello, David. Welcome. Whoa, pardon me. Well, down to 3, but that's right. We'll wait a minute for people to join. G'day, Albert. And while people are joining, we might as well start with the updates. Firstly, on the main video situation, yeah, I know I've been not very active in the past month or so. But yeah, I've just been pretty busy and I'm slowly plugging away. I'm getting there. But yeah. The next video that I'm currently editing is of exploring an abandoned power station, and the raw footage is 3 hours long because that's about how long I was there for. And yeah, it's just slow but steady. We'll get there. Also, you'll notice that we're back on the old setup today rather than the new one which you saw last live stream. Yeah, my main computer, I should say, is having a lot of trouble and it needs repair, and Apple can't do it. So I've ordered myself a broken computer to try and fix up 2 broken computers to make one good computer, but story for another time. Apart from that, in terms of map updates, I updated the Footscray goods line, so that's along the Maribyrnong River. Added a mobile Altona siding, and I have added a few tracks around the Dynon area. But that's it for the updates. And g'day, Herman. Albert says, I'm really looking forward to the power station video. Yeah, I am too. So this was filmed like 2 years ago. Coming up to 3 now. Yeah. And it's just been sitting with me. It should be good. So tonight's topic is an introduction to industrial tramways. Firstly, the very first thing that I would like to say is please don't get them confused with what you think of what is more technically referred to as electric street tramways. Yes, the trams that you see running around Melbourne, they, of course, are trams, and that's called a tramway as well, but its primary purpose is conveying passengers rather than conveying goods. And so, yeah, and they're rather they're constructed to a relatively higher standard than a lot of industrial tramways. So industrial tramways are lower grade railways, effectively. How many were there? Nobody knows a definite number, but hundreds in Australia, in Victoria alone, possibly thousands. I don't know about that in Victoria, but definitely around Australia there'd be at least 1,000 over the whole of history. And throughout the world, there'd be millions easily, again, throughout history. You could argue that tramways predate railways. And so the logical next question is, okay, that's great. What's the difference between a railway and a tramway? Now, that's an age-old question that doesn't have a definite answer. Again, generally speaking, tramways were of a lower quality track, used lighter equipment, higher grades, possibly even horse-drawn. But then you have a lot of weird crossovers, right? Where there's high quality, where's the line between a high quality tramway and a low quality railway? The Victorian railways had a line which went from Welshpool to Port Welshpool, and it was horse-drawn its entire life. There was no steam locomotives or anything on it, to my knowledge. I'm pretty sure of that fact, but there's a chance I could be wrong. Anyway, it was definitely horse-drawn for a lot of the time, and that is something that you would typically see in a tramway, not a railway, even though it was technically a railway. And on the opposite end of the scale, you've got the SEC Yallourn area tramways. They were electric. They were quite heavy trains, or trams, I guess. And yeah, it was quite the operation. And you'll quite often hear it being referred to as the SEC Railway. Notice railway, not tramway. Again, the difference is really technical. And traditionally, it was defined by legislation, the legislation which it was authorised under. Would tell you as a more definite thing whether it was railways or tramways, but yeah, in truth, there's no set boundary really between one and the other. So yeah, what were tramways used for? Anything and everything. Some carried passengers. It was rare. It wasn't as common as goods, put it that way. And a lot of them carried passengers unofficially, but few ran a timetabled service. That's the sort of thing that I mean. Yeah, there were a couple. Notable examples include the Paltown Tramway from Yarra. What is it? It's not Yarra Glen. It's another one of those. Yarra Junction. That's right. Yarra Junction to Paltown. And also there was the Sorrento, a tramway in Sorrento. There was a tramway which carried passengers from Kerrang to Koondrook, which was later taken over by the railways. So that's another weird example where it's like it started as a tramway. The equipment was literally old railway stock. And then it was later taken over completely by the railways, the Victorian railways. So what's the big difference? Technical. There was no real functional difference, put it that way, on that example. And yeah, so who built tramways? Who were they run by? Was there a central source? No, there was no central source. They were built by private contractors or councils, or the equivalent of back in the day. And yeah, they were built by various people and to varying standards. Yeah. Roderick Smith says, I've missed the opening 7 minutes. Catamount height was like Kundruk, a Shire-owned tramway. Yep. I didn't specifically mention Catamatite, but that's another one. Doogie to Catamatite, which was again taken over by the railways later in life. I've not mentioned the Silverton Tramway yet, but yes, that was another famous example in outback New South Wales, just west of Broken Hill, sort of. The Silverton Tramway was operated very much like a railway, but again, technical difference. It was classed as a tramway because of the legislation it was constructed under. But yeah, and I believe the Silverton Tramway carried passengers, but I'd say its primary purpose was goods. That's what it was built for, put it that way. But somebody can confirm or deny that. And so, yeah, the other thing is that in terms of quality of tramway construction, some had locomotives, some didn't. Some were electrified, like the SEC one. Most weren't. It was rare to have an electric tramway. But yeah, there are varying qualities. A lot of them were horse-drawn, and a lot of them were built using wooden track. So yeah, even what you traditionally think of as the rails, well, they were wooden. And just because I know I had this question once, the wooden rails were not shaped the same way as steel rails. You imagine the sort of shape of a normal rail, the cross-sectional shape. That's for steel, but for wooden rails, it was just square or rectangular prism, whatever you want to call it. And yeah, obviously wooden track, cheaper, more readily available in the bush, which a lot of tramways were. And yeah, which were a better option for a lot of the time, but they come with the biggest disadvantage being even the highest quality timbers are not as good as the lowest quality steels. So you would you couldn't run anything terribly heavy on wooden track, and it would require a lot of maintenance. But yeah. Albert says, would you consider Queensland sugarcane trains to fall under the umbrella of industrial tramways? Absolutely. They're another example that really blur the line between tramways and railways. You could definitely class them as railways in that they are hauling heavy loads. In fact, I believe that the sugarcane tramways combined gross tonnage of goods was greater than the Victorian railways at many times. So, yeah, they even the sugarcane tramways. There's not these days. Obviously, sugarcane tramways. A lot of them are still running. Most of them are locomotive hauled, but there's some of them that are still hauled by a tractor, certain sections. So yeah, the biggest, I think that the biggest difference between the sugarcane railways and the normal railways would be the fact that the wagons on sugarcane tramways are not braked. The only form of braking is on the locomotive. And that works fine for the sugarcane tramways, but on more massive mainline freight trains, obviously you need the whole train to be braked. JW, whatever your name is, pictures. I wish I will get to a stage one day where I can put up pictures on the stream, but I can't do it at the moment. But if you search up for sugarcane tramways, SEC your lawn tramway, any of the tramways which I mention during the stream, if you just Google them, you'll be sure to find a lot of pictures. And I guess this is as good a time of any to mention that there is an entire society dedicated to researching tramways, which is the Light Railways Research Society of Australia, LRRSA. And they publish books and they detail tramways, and they put out a magazine. If you're going to study tramways, they are your primary source in Australia. Roderick Smith says Tarrawingi Tramway out of Broken Hill was owned by New South Wales Railways, but operated by Silverton. New South Wales standard gauge hadn't reached Broken Hill yet. Silverton was the main passenger carrier to Adelaide right until 1970. There you go. Silverton is an interesting tramway. So if you go, if you want to see a tramway, systems of tramways that are in use to this day, Queensland is your number one destination for that, specifically the North Coast. You'll find tramways littered all along there. And if you go on the train from Brisbane to Cairns, you'll notice that tramways cross over the railways quite a few times. And in my video where I was going on the Spirit of Queensland to Cairns, I show the crossings of a few tramways and a few bridges. I think I showed even a few wagons, a few cane bins, but I didn't see any trains, or I'd call them trains on sugarcane lines running. The things that ran on the tramways were more often than not referred to as trains, not trams, even though it's not a railway as such. The naming gets a bit weird, but Paul O'Connor says sugarcane railways would be generally quite level, negating the need for brakes. Yes, that's the primary reason. There are some parts of the sugarcane tramways which do get quite steep, but for the most part, it's rather flat. And so, they don't need a lot of brakes. And that's obviously when they are going on the higher gradient sections, they'll carry less load. Or I'm not sure if they ever have braked wagons. They could possibly, but for the most part, they definitely aren't braked. Rod says Queensland Shire-operated Mapletown Tramway had a scheduled passenger service. Likewise, Queensland Railways operated Innisfail Tramway. The original line south from Cairns was a tramway absorbed into the North Coast Railway. There you go. Lots of examples in Queensland. And Tasmania had quite a few tramways that got absorbed into railways over the years, most famously Emu Bay. But yeah, that's another good point now that I'm on Tasmania. If you would like to ride a traditional tramway on a passenger service, then the Queenstown tramway, they call it the West Coast Wilderness Railway, but it was originally a tramway. But yeah, that you can go visit. It's a popular tourist attraction in Tassie. Herman's Channel says the first garage was built for a tramway, I think. Quite possibly in Tasmania. I don't know enough to confirm or deny that, but it could. I wouldn't be surprised, put it that way. Yeah, and so I guess timber tramways. Oh, come on. Okay, we're back. So yeah, pretty much anywhere you found timber being used, you find timber tramways in Australia, at least, and I'm sure in many other parts of the world as well. Timber tramways were interesting. They often had, I guess, think of it as the main line for the tramway that was locomotive hauled, steel rails, potentially operated a scheduled timetable passenger service. Relatively high quality. But yeah, that was sort of the trunk line, and you would have wooden railed branch lines, if you like. The area that I'm most familiar with is Rubicon, because I've got the book. Is it here? No, it's not readily available, but I've shown it before. Rails to Rubicon by Peter Evans. Excellent book. That's sort of what I'm most familiar with. And in that example, you had the railways going to as far as Alexandria, and then you had what was called the Alexandria Steel Tramway, connecting literally in Alexandria Railway Yard, and many tramways connected into existing railway yards. But anyway, then it went sort of south from Alexandria and went as far as Rubicon, or the Rubicon Forest. And I think from memory, it got as far as the location of Tin Hut, which was, pretty much Tin Hut. Not originally. Originally, it was just to the depot, which was, 700 meters up the road from Tin Hut. But yeah, anyway, from Tin Hut, the timber tramways were then mostly one. There was a few sections along the lines which were steel, but for the most part they were all wooden railed, and so those lines would then service the mills of the timber mills in the area. Then from the timber mills, they would branch out into the forest, and they would be your logging tramways. So you'd have the logs cut down out in the forest, loaded onto the logging tramway, transported usually down the hill to the sawmill, processed in the sawmill, and then the timber would be sent down to Tin Hut and loaded onto the steel tramway, transported to Alexandria, exported. from there. But yeah, they were all of the railed lines were horse-drawn, and I guess it's a common misconception by the general public, at least, that the horses which were used to haul the loads were poorly treated. That's really not true. The horse operators, I guess you could call them, drivers, whatever, they were privately contracted, they were employed, and they employed their own horses, and they cared very much about their horses, and I'm sure there would be some examples of them being mistreated, but for the most part, they were quite well treated. Rod says Mount Lyell was always called a railway, and yes, the first garret was for Northeast Dundas Tramway. There you go. So I think Rubicon is a great example of this question also, which is, what gauge were tramways? Those of you familiar with railways will know the whole break of gauge debacle. Tramways were no better. In fact, they were arguably worse. While the sort of standard tramway gauge, if you like, was 2 foot, there was a lot of 2 foot tramways, 610 millimeters. There really was no standard in the end. 3 foot 6 was another sort of common standard, but yeah, there was a lot of break of gauge. And in Rubicon, for example, the whole Rubicon system, there was the Alexandria steel tramway, which was 2 foot. Then there was 3 foot 6 inch wooden rails. There was 3 foot 4.5, 3 foot 4.25, and changing back and forth. They had to do a few transshipments, put it that way. And I mentioned in my live stream episode on gauges that with wooden rails, it becomes a bit relative, the gauge. And famously, timber tramway trucks were built with very wide flanges to accommodate a wide variation in gauge. So yeah, they might have said that that was 4 foot 4.25 or whatever, but it varied by a bit. In fact, I think at one point they measured it and they said it could vary up to a few inches. So there you go. Albert says the Pemberton Tramway and the Rottnest Island Tramway in Western Australia and the Armoury Tramway in Sydney are other ex-industrial tramways that now carry tourist passengers. Yeah, there you go. Herman's Channel said, if it was mistreated, it wouldn't be up to its so it wouldn't be as effective, yes. So it wouldn't be beneficial to mistreat a horse. Yeah, good point. Yeah, there's the logical argument like that where, you know, the horses won't perform their best, but I certainly get the feeling that the horse drivers legitimately liked their horse and liked their horse to be happy, and so the horses were treated quite well as a result. Herman's Channel says 600 millimeters, which was slightly different to 2 foot. That's the problem in Europe, where it's 600 millimeters on the continent and 2 foot in the UK. Yeah, and again, the difference is minimal, but it can make a difference depending on everything. And yeah, Herman's Channel says 600 millimeters ish. What do you mean ish? Well, it's mostly 600 millimeters. What I meant was, like, when I said ish, I meant that if you took what they said as the official gauge and then you compared it to, you literally measured the gauge between the rails at various different points. Not so much on steel railed tramways, but certainly on wooden railed tramways, the true gauge could vary quite a bit, as I mentioned. And so that's why I sort of said 2 foot-ish or 600 millimeters-ish, because that might be the official measurement, but the unofficial measurement could be quite different. The logging tramways were of particular interest because it's not like, I guess in more traditional, when you think of traditional railways or tramways for that matter, the wagons, if you like, are of a set length and you've got to fit your freight into that length. Wasn't so much the case on logging tramways, because obviously trees can vary quite a bit in height, and depending on how far up the stump you choose to cut it down and whatnot, the tree could be of various lengths. So the way that logs were transported on tramways is that they had loose trucks, and the log would be one end on the one truck, one end on the other truck, and there's nothing connecting the two trucks apart from like a chain or something like that, just as like in case it slips, to stop it from slipping away. But the point is that there was no set length between the trucks, and it could be accommodating for whatever size log you had. Although, depending on what you're harvesting, they will mostly be the same size anyway. But they were often, they were almost always braked, because when you're hauling heavy loads in the forest on steep gradients, you do need braking, and especially if you've got horses, they can't really brake the train or whatever for you. So that was part of the driver's duties, was braking the trucks, and they weren't air operated or anything like that, like traditional railway brakes. They were just operated on a rope or a chain or something like that. It worked. Wasn't the best solution, but it worked. Did they fail? Sometimes. I don't know how many people have died on tramways, but it would be quite a few. They were fairly risky at a lot of times. And thinking of which, passengers would sometimes ride on top of the logs. In a lot of cases, passengers weren't technically allowed to travel on these trams or trains or whatever you want to call them, but they often did, because the alternative was walking. There were no roads in a lot of cases, so you'd either walk along the tramway, which was about the only clearing, or you just hop on. And the drivers were private contractors, and they turned a blind eye to it most of the time. So unofficial carrying of passengers happened quite a bit. And so, yeah, sticking with the Rubicon theme, the Rubicon is most famous, I'd say, for not its timber tramways, but the SEC tramways. SEC, of course, built the Rubicon Hydroelectric scheme up there, and it was definitely one of the first hydroelectric schemes in the world. It wasn't the first, but it was one of the first, and possibly the first in Australia. I would have to do my research again with that. Yeah, and Herman says if the boss doesn't find out, it never happened. Well, the boss found out a lot of the time, but the boss couldn't really do anything, put it that way. The boss wasn't necessarily happy about it, but yeah, what can you do when your precious contractors just say, bugger you. Anyway, going back to the hydroelectric scheme, they use tramways to construct the scheme and also to operate it, or maintain it, I should say. The SEC built some of their own tramways and they connected them to existing timber tramways in the area. And yeah, they transported a lot of stuff across them. It was a big boom for the area. And in fact, there's one sort of infamous, I guess, example of where a generator was being carried to the Rubicon Falls power station, and they had transported it along the wooden railed tramways, this big heavy generator, and then it was coming around a curve and it fell off and rolled down the hill and into the creek below. That was a pretty expensive mistake, as you can imagine, and they had to haul it back up onto the tramway, transport it back out to get it repaired, and then bring it back in and not drop it into the river, but instead slowly lower it down the hill on a specially constructed SEC tramway. And yes, I haven't said hello to Braxton and Melbourne and Regional Trains vlogs, or MyTV. I remember that now. Braxton says, I hate working on Saturdays, especially when I start at 5 a.m. Well, yeah, I'm sure you do. And tramway drivers often had an early start as well, because they had to get everything ready, potentially get out to the forest, and clock on time was, perhaps 8 a.m. out in the forest. So it might take you a few hours to get there. So a 5 a.m. wake up wouldn't be too unheard of, I'd say. So apart from constructing the hydroelectric power stations in Rubicon, they were used for maintaining the tramway and maintaining the pipeline and the aqueducts of the various power stations in the area. The most famous of which was the so-called Incline Tramway. Now, incline tramways weren't uncommon, but they generally weren't steel railed, because if you're going to the trouble of building steel railways, then steel rails, then you probably don't want such steep gradients. But this was an exception, and it's one of the more interesting haulage methods. Was not a horse, was not a locomotive, way too steep for a locomotive. It was hauled by a winch, an electric winch wired directly into the power station. Not too often you see that. The gradients were anywhere from 1 in 3 to, I think the average was 1 in 3, the average gradient of that incline, with the maximum gradient on it being 1 in 2. So rather steep. And the rails, although they're not used, are still there today. So you can go to Rubicon and you can walk up it if you like. I haven't done it. I plan to do it at some stage. A couple of friends have done it. It's very steep. They said it was more scary coming down than going up because there's lots of gravel to slip on. Yeah, and Herman says, I'm sorry, what? That's really bloody steep. Yeah, it's not something, in traditional railways, the most you'll see is 1 in 30 on the steepest of lines, and that's considered very steep. On a main line, no more than 1 in 50, or even less, preferably. Yeah, I think that when the brown coal traffic, I think that was. Oh, come on. And we're back. When the line was upgraded for the brown coal traffic, I think that ever had gradients reduced. It was either to 1 in 80 or 1 in 100. I can't. Somebody can figure that one out for me. But yeah, so that it did indeed carry passengers officially for the most part, and yeah, the cool thing was that I really wish I had the book with me, but being so steep, the passenger carriage, if you like, that was hauled up the hill, if you imagine that's the hill, the carriage sat like that. So if you imagine being on a flat surface, the carriage, if you like, was sort of tilted a little bit. But yeah, it wasn't a scheduled service and a timetabled service, I should say, and I don't think anyone paid. There was no tickets as such or anything like that. I mean, it was such a remote area, but it was used for the SEC employees and anyone who worked in the forest and needed to get up the hill. They would be welcome to join. Put it that way. But yeah, once you got to the top of the incline, the gradients flattened out a bit, and there is still steel rails going along the aqueduct, and there used to be a few different vehicles which carried maintenance workers and forestry workers as well. There were 2 main vehicles that did that. One was referred to as the Jeep. It was an odd-looking thing. Again, just go by Rails to Rubicon if you want to learn all about this and more. It's a really fascinating book. But the other one was literally called the Tram. It was an electric tram. It was battery electric, which is really interesting, especially being so old. You don't really see battery electric trams very often, but it looked pretty similar to what you would think of as a tram in Melbourne. Smaller, but it looks like a tram, and hence the name. And it carried passengers officially. So again, it was the same sort of thing where It wasn't technically a public service, but you could. Yeah. Roderick Smith says, I have ridden the Rubicon Incline. I count it as 30 degrees looking vertical. Our steep ski slopes on average 23 degrees. There was another incline up the ridge between the Late and Hauqua rivers. Yeah, there was a few other incline tramways in the Rubicon area as well, but none of them were, and they were used with various methods, but not an electric winch. Yeah, they more often than not used sort of a balancing weight system. I don't think there was any steam winches or anything like that. And it's I think that it would be an interesting tourist attraction if the Rubicon Tramway could be opened up to passengers again. It's a possibility, but yeah, who knows? In the meantime, you can enjoy the tramway attractions in Alexandria. And Albert says, what is now the scenic railway in Katoomba in New South Wales started life as an industrial tramway, which hauled and a gradient of 52 degrees steeper than 1:1. Yeah, and I believe that is the steepest track in Australia. Marty V says, hey Floyd, have you ever considered chasing mainline train and filming at different locations? Yes, I have. Although I know it's I'm not so as into it as others are. But yeah, I'll do it one day. I've done it before, just haven't filmed it. Anyway, getting back to things. That's a nice little teaser of the Rubicon Tramways. Again, if you want to learn more, go buy Rails to Rubicon. You can buy it online or you can buy it in railway bookstores. Excellent book. I haven't finished it, by the way. I know I've had it for a while, but I haven't finished it. But I'm getting there, slowly but surely. The last example of a tramway that I would like to touch on was one that was very common around Victoria. Saltworks Tramways. Saltworks Tramways were primarily run by the company Cheetham Saltworks. They had two main Saltworks Tramways, one in Laverton, one in Geelong, and neither of which have rails remaining. I think you might be able to see a little bit of remains in Geelong. The Laverton one is certainly pretty much completely gone. But yeah, there was also one up in Linga in the northwest, Victoria, very small town, Linga. And yeah, I believe that was also operated by Cheetham at some point. But yeah, conveying salt was a great use of tramways. And in a lot of the salt lakes, just very lightly constructed tramways that went into the lake, into the salt lake. They often had very large sleepers to try and spread the load as much as possible. Some of them used horses. Some of them were even just pushed by hand. But yeah, Cheetham Saltworks employed locomotives and stuff in the actual saltworks, and possibly on the Linga Tramway. But yeah, I am planning on at some stage doing a video of the Linger tramway. Yeah, and Roderick Smith says Alexandria had the first diesel locomotives in Victoria, 1930s, built by Kelly and Lewis. Both are preserved in working order by the Alexandria Timber Tramway Museum. Kelly and Lewis built electric locos for SEC when German sources were blocked. There you go. Yeah, tramways were often used off-the-shelf sort of equipment. If you research tramways, you'll find there's a lot of common names like Kelly and Lewis, Malcolm and Moore, Tackle. Those are just a few that come to mind immediately, but yeah. Victorian Transport Video says, my grandfather worked at Kelly and Lewis. There you go. Yeah, Fowler. Yes, Fowler was another big one. There's all your traditional locomotive builders like Baldwin. Is it Baldwin? I think it is Baldwin. Bayer Peacock. Yeah. There were lots. Tramways were used in, I've sort of briefly mentioned that tramways were used in construction. That was another very common use. Yeah. Thinking of aqueduct tramways servicing power stations, the Bogong Creek Tramway servicing the power station up there is indeed still in use. So yeah, you might go and see that operating. I would like to, but yeah. Kerr Stewart, another one. Hudswell Clark, yep. Is Victorian Transport Videos asks, is Downer one? I haven't necessarily heard of Downer. I think they're a relatively new company. But yeah, I'm not entirely sure. Yeah, construction tramways were often lightly laid because they could. They often used steel rails, but lightly laid so that it was easy to reposition them as needed. And yeah, it brings up another good point, which is that you'll notice in my all lines map that I have got a few tramways mapped out. I do plan to eventually add as many as possible, but I mean, it's striving towards perfection. You'll never reach there, but you can get close. Anyway, with a lot of construction tramways, it can often be hard to map their route because they change so much. And yeah, if it was just there for the construction and that's it, which could be anywhere from a few weeks to a few months to a few years, maybe at most, then yeah, how do you choose what to map and what not to map? Yeah. Roderick Smith says LRSA used to have tours on the Bogong Creek, now banned. I've visited Cheetham, Laverton and Geelong with LRSA. Yeah, unfortunately, that's a reality with modern OH&S and whatnot. It's very hard to get approval for that sort of thing. Even just a tour to the site of tramways can be difficult. But yeah, it's doable. What's some other examples? Good examples of tramways. Oh, military. Yeah. the military used a lot of tramways. And in fact, just as a little side note, was it last night or the night before? I think it was the night before. No, it was last night. I attended an LRRSA meeting, and the topic of the meeting was the tramways of the Western Front during the World War. I mean, both World War One and Two, but yeah, you just get the idea that tramways were used prolifically, and there's a lot of surplus stock which got sold off and used and whatnot. But the military was a prolific user of tramways, and most famously in Victoria, you had the Truganina munitions tramway, both in Altona and in Truganina, and you also had the Maribyrnong Explosive Reserve, which there's a lot of tracks still there in Maribyrnong. There's a little bit in Truganina, none in Altona. Or there might be the slightest sliver in Altona, I'm not entirely sure. Jay Boston, g'day Jay, asks, do trams have different bell sounds around the world? Well, this presentation isn't necessarily about those sort of trams, but to answer your question anyway, yes, short answer. Different trams around Melbourne have different bell sounds, so listen out. Transport Videos asks, are you seeing the 3 loco lash up on the Apex tomorrow if it returns to Brooklyn with X31 up front? No, I'm hiking some railways around Melbourne, and you'll see those videos in due time. I'm not big on chasing trains, as I've sort of said, but yeah. Rod Smith says most Victorian timber tramways had gone by the 1940s. Yeah. Policy after 1926 and 1939 fires, and road transport improved after World War One. LRRSA has a film of the last survivor. Yeah. Timber, the big fire risk with timber milling was that the mills and the workers all lived in the forest, and yeah, there's quite a few stories of narrow escapes from fires and also tragic deaths from bushfires. And yeah, between the 1926 and the 1939 fires wiped out a lot of mills and forest. I mean, I think the 39 fires wiped out something like 80% of Victoria's forest, or at least the alpine region forests. Like that's insane. And no, Victorian videos, I do not know times of the Apex. But yeah, the military, as I briefly mentioned, they used it for transporting munitions mainly, but passengers on the occasion. I'm sure Puckapunyal has had a few military tramways. I think there was a few industrial tramways before the military took over Puckapunyal. But yeah, it's really a big. It's like opening a can of worms. Tramways. You know, when I first started doing looking into railways, I was like, okay, this is pretty huge, and you know, covering all the tracks and whatnot. That's quite a bit. Then I discovered tramways, and it's equally as big, if not bigger. So, as part of that, I have joined the Light Railways Research Society, as I have mentioned a few times. and I hope to contribute to tramway research over the course of my life, I guess. Yeah, maybe I'll write a book one day, but that's probably 10 years off at least. Good question, Victorian Transport Videos. Where's the place in the thumbnail? Rubicon. Yes, my favourite tramway of all time, just because it was the first one that I really discovered. The picture is specifically of the SEC sawmill, which, if you want to see it yourself, it's kind of a little bit tricky to get to. You've got to drive as close as you can to what is called the Royston Power Station, I believe, and then walk a bit up the track, and as you turn the corner just before the Trestle Bridge, a little bit before the Trestle Bridge, so if you sort of look about halfway between the Trestle Bridge on Google Maps and the what do you call it? Power station, that's right. Then you'll find that's where the photo was taken. And there's like an old house there that's converted into like a camp type thing. And yeah, if you look up my map, I have mapped the SECU tramways in Rubicon, and I've started on the timber tramways in the area as well. It can get quite messy towards the Tin Hut area, but because there was literally like 3 different tracks at one point, it was a bit stupid. But read Rails to Rubicon and you'll see all about it. But anyway, look on my map and you'll find it, and Google, and I'm sure you'll find information. Rails to Rubicon as well. I keep saying it, but it's true. Rod Smith says Puckapunyal didn't have military, but took over territory which held McIver Tramway 1600mm gauge with XVR locos. There you go. And yeah, put Rubicon on your list to visit. It's I plan to go back there one day, and I've already got a rough plan in mind for hiking all of the SEC lines, and then I'll have to go back another time to do all the timber lines. But yeah, it's going to be good. Anyway, we've passed the hour mark well and truly by now. We're at an hour and 4 minutes almost, and 7 likes, 8 people watching. Thanks for watching, everyone. So what's next? 2 weeks' time, I will do another live stream. Will it be back to the new setup on the new computer? Possibly. Or I can possibly rig it up to this computer. We'll see. But definitely live stream in 2 weeks. No video on this Sunday, possibly next Sunday. As I said, it's really unknown at this point. I know I keep being wishy-washy, but hey, that's what you get. It's free, and I do it all in my spare time. So thanks for... I sound grumpy, but I'm not. Thanks for all the support. And thanks to everyone who turns up on the stream. I really enjoy the streams, and I'm sure you do as well. So I'll definitely continue them. They're easy enough to do. Topic for the next one? I don't know. One of the ones on my list. Goodbye for the 5th time. It really is the last time this time. Bye-bye.